It's a cold night in May in a stretch of Argyll forest that hasn't heard this sound in over 400 years. Water slapping against wood, teeth grinding through willow. Something ancient waking back up. Scientists are crouched in the dark with cameras and GPS trackers, watching 11 animals step out of transport crates and into a Scottish loch for the very first time. Nobody in that forest that night truly knew what was about to happen. Not the scientists, not the government, not even the animals themselves. All anyone knew for certain was this: beavers had been gone from Scotland since the 16th century, hunted into oblivion. And now, for the first time in recorded British history, someone was trying to bring them back on purpose, under license, in front of the entire world. What happened over the next 15 years didn't just surprise the people watching. It rewrote what scientists thought they knew about extinction, genetics, rivers, and whether a single missing species could really hold an entire landscape together. Before we get into it, if you want more stories like this, one where the real ending is stranger and messier than the headlines ever let on, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell right now, because you are not going to want to miss where this one goes. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back to why beavers disappeared in the first place. And the reason is stranger than most people realize. Yes, beavers were hunted for their fur and their meat. But there was a second reason, one that barely makes it into any documentary. Beavers carry a gland near the base of their tail that produces a thick, musky secretion called castoreum. For centuries, castoreum was prized in perfumery and later in the food industry, where it was used as a natural flavoring to add warm, vanilla-like or fruity notes to certain products. It's still classified as safe for consumption by American regulators today, though the wild internet rumor that your ice cream is secretly full of beaver secretions is mostly outdated. Harvesting it is expensive and difficult, so almost nobody uses it anymore. But historically, that scent was valuable enough that it helped drive an entire species out of an entire country. By the time trappers were done, there wasn't a single wild beaver left standing in Scotland. Rivers that had been shaped by beaver engineering for thousands of years were suddenly left to run wild and unmanaged, and over 4 centuries, the landscape adapted to their absence. Wetlands dried out. Water moved faster and rougher. An entire category of habitat quietly vanished, and almost nobody alive remembered what had been lost. Fast forward to the year 2009. After years of debate, environmental review, and political hesitation, the Scottish government finally approved something called the Scottish Beaver Trial. 11 Eurasian beavers, sourced from Norway, were quarantined for months to make sure they carried no disease, then split into 3 family groups and released into the lochs of Knapdale Forest in Argyll. This was the first officially licensed reintroduction of a wild mammal in British history. Every step was watched. Camera traps, DNA sampling, GPS collars, Scottish natural heritage. The government body in charge genuinely did not know what would happen. Would the beavers remember how to build dams after 400 years of their species being gone from this specific landscape? Would they survive Scottish winters? Would the local community accept them or demand they be removed? The answer came almost immediately, and it was not subtle. Within weeks, the beavers were already at work, dragging branches into narrow channels, packing mud into gaps, slowly turning quiet trickles of water into full ponds. It looked less like animal behavior and more like construction. And this is where most videos on this topic would tell you the simple version. 11 beavers, 1 dead river, a happy ending. But the real story is more complicated than that, and honestly, more interesting. Here's the part almost nobody puts in the headline. The official Knapdale release wasn't actually where Scotland's beaver comeback began. Years earlier, around 2001, wild beavers were already quietly breeding in the River Tay catchment, hundreds of miles from Knapdale. Nobody officially put them there. They were either escapees from private collections or the result of secretive illegal releases carried out by so-called rogue rewilders, private individuals who took reintroduction into their own hands without permission or a license. To this day, nobody has ever been publicly identified as responsible. When the government discovered this unauthorized population, their first instinct was to trap them and remove them entirely. And by 2010, there were real, serious plans in motion to do exactly that. Public pressure pushed back hard. Conservationists argued there was no evidence these beavers were the wrong genetic stock, and that removing an already established breeding population made no ecological sense. In 2012, the government reversed course, and the Tay population was allowed to stay. In other words, part of Scotland's celebrated beaver comeback wasn't a carefully planned government success story at all. It was the result of quiet defiance by people who were never caught, and a government that eventually had no choice but to accept what nature and a handful of anonymous humans had already decided. There's also a persistent myth worth clearing up right here, because it shapes a lot of the conflict you're about to hear about later in this video. Many people assume beavers cause problems because they're hunting or disturbing fish. They aren't. Beavers are strict herbivores. They eat bark, leaves, twigs, and aquatic plants, nothing else. Every conflict involving beavers and fish comes down to their dams altering water flow, not predation. It sounds like a small detail, but it matters because it means the entire debate over beavers and salmon is really a debate about engineering, not appetite. If you're finding this as strange and layered as I did while researching it, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people. And honestly, the next part is where things get even stranger, because this is the part where scientists themselves got blindsided. Here's a detail that makes the next part hit even harder. Norway wasn't chosen as the source for the original 11 beavers because of any genetic analysis. It was chosen mainly because Norwegian beaver skulls look similar in shape to old beaver remains found in Britain. Full genetic testing on the animals themselves didn't happen until years after the release, mostly because the scientific tools to do it properly simply weren't available yet at the time. So the decision that would define the genetic future of this entire population was made on skeletal resemblance, not DNA. Keep that in mind because it's about to matter a lot. See, both of these populations, the official Knapdale release and the unofficial Tay population, eventually merged into the foundation of everything that came after. And when researchers finally went back years later and ran deep genetic testing on these founding beavers, they found something deeply concerning, hiding in plain sight the entire time. The 11 beavers brought over from Norway all came from a single source population, and it turns out Norwegian beavers themselves had been hunted to near extinction back in the 1880s, which meant the source population being used to rebuild an entire British species was already genetically thin to begin with. A peer-reviewed study using high-density genetic sequencing found that the original Knapdale population had a heterozygosity score of just 0.052. In plain English, that number is alarmingly low. It signals a population at real risk of inbreeding, reduced fertility, and long-term vulnerability to disease. By the time the original trial period ended in 2014, researchers could only confirm 9 beavers were still alive at the site. 9. From an original release of 11, the population that was supposed to prove reintroduction could work was, quietly, almost failing from the inside. Not because of predators, not because of politics, but because of math written into their DNA before they ever set foot in Scotland. Conservationists responded by doing something rarely attempted in British wildlife management. They deliberately introduced new beavers from a different genetic source specifically to boost diversity, essentially running an emergency genetic rescue operation on a population that had only existed for a few years. It worked, in the sense that overall genetic diversity did increase substantially afterward. But here's the twist: scientists still haven't fully resolved. Nobody yet knows for certain whether these two separate genetic lines have actually interbred and mixed together across generations. If they have, Knapdale's beavers could end up carrying a specific genetic combination that doesn't exist anywhere else in the beaver populations of Europe. An accidental, one-of-a-kind population born entirely out of a conservation emergency nobody saw coming when this whole thing started. While all of that was happening quietly beneath the surface, out in the open, the beavers themselves were transforming the landscape in ways researchers could actually measure. The University of Stirling has been studying beaver activity on Tayside since 2003, and their findings are honestly staggering. In streams where beavers had been active, the number of different species found increased by 28% compared to nearby beaver-free streams. The retention of organic matter, essentially the nutrients and material that keep an ecosystem fed, increased by up to 7 times. Aquatic plant life increased 20-fold. And on the pollution side, researchers found that phosphorus levels, a major agricultural pollutant, were roughly cut in half in beaver-engineered streams, while nitrate levels dropped by more than 40%. Then, in a newer study published in 2025, researchers wanted to test this even more directly. Instead of just observing existing pollution levels, they simulated a real pollution event on purpose. They took 2 nearly identical streams at the Banff Estate, one shaped by beaver dams, one left completely natural as a control, and deliberately dumped a slurry of livestock waste into both of them to see what would happen. In the untouched stream, the bacterial pollution moved through fast and strong. In the beaver-engineered stream, the dams and ponds trapped and slowed that same pollution so effectively that peak bacterial contamination was reduced by more than 95%. 95%. From animals that were never trained, never engineered, never designed by any human for this purpose. They were simply doing what beavers have always instinctively done, and it turned out to function almost exactly like a natural water treatment system. Now, if this story ended here, it would just be another feel-good conservation video. But it doesn't end here, and honestly, this next part is the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place, because most channels leave it out entirely. In 2019, beavers officially gained European protected species status in Scotland. On paper, that sounds like the end of the threat. In reality, it wasn't. Under Scottish law, beavers can still be legally shot under license when they're found to be causing serious damage to farmland, usually through flooding caused by their dam building. And the numbers here are genuinely uncomfortable to look at. 87 beavers were legally killed in 2019, 125 in 2020, 87 again in 2021, 63 in 2022. That's over 360 legally killed beavers within just a few years of the species supposedly being protected. An investigative outlet in Scotland used Freedom of Information requests to dig even deeper, and what they found was troubling. Of 268 beavers killed by licensed controllers between 2019 and 2021, only 4 carcasses were ever submitted for a post-mortem examination to confirm the animals had actually been killed humanely. Official welfare reviews of the small sample that was examined found real problems. Some beavers had been shot with underpowered weapons or from ranges too far to guarantee an instant death. Some were pregnant. Some were actively nursing young at the time they were shot. Animal welfare groups have specifically pushed for a ban on shooting beavers while they're in water, because a wounded animal can sink and drown slowly instead of dying instantly, which is exactly the kind of outcome a protected species classification is supposed to prevent. To be fair, there's real nuance here, and progress has genuinely been made. As trapping and relocation programs run by conservation groups and government agencies have scaled up, the percentage of conflict beavers that get safely relocated instead of killed has climbed dramatically from under 30% a few years ago to around 90% more recently. But the underlying tension hasn't disappeared. Beaver dams can flood valuable farmland, and government support payments for turning that farmland into wildlife buffer zones often aren't generous enough to compete financially with simply farming that land or applying for a license to remove the animals causing the problem. Which means, in a lot of cases, the decision of whether a beaver lives or dies in modern Scotland still comes down less to ecology and more to which option makes better financial sense for the landowner standing in that field. There's also an ongoing fight with anglers who've long argued that beaver dams block migratory fish like salmon from reaching their spawning grounds. But even here, the data tells a more complicated story than either side likes to admit. On the River Isla, researchers tested a modified approach called dam notching, where a small section of an existing beaver dam is deliberately cut open to let fish and water pass through without destroying the structure entirely. The results showed that 94% of tagged salmon smolts successfully pass through these notched dams. In other words, coexistence isn't some fantasy. It's measurable, and in many cases, it's already working. It just requires constant active management rather than either extreme of total removal or total hands-off rewilding. If you're still with me at this point, you're clearly someone who actually cares about the real complicated version of these stories and not just the highlight reel. So let me ask you something quickly before we wrap this up. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you think beavers belong back across the rest of the UK or whether the farmland conflict is too costly to justify it. I genuinely read these, and I want to know where you land on this. So where does all of this leave us today? As of the most recent surveys, Scotland's beaver population is now estimated at more than 2,000 individuals spread across 6 separate river catchments, including Knapdale, Tayside, the Forth, Loch Lomond, the Cairngorms, and the Bowley catchment, where new releases were approved as recently as 2025. In October of 2025, 7 more beavers were released into Glen Affric, one of the most celebrated landscapes in the Scottish Highlands, marking yet another official return after 4 centuries of absence. The Scottish government now has a formal long-term target called Scotland's Beaver Strategy, running all the way through 2045, aimed at continuing to expand beaver range across the country under careful, licensed management. And there's an economic side to this story too, one that rarely gets mentioned. Wildlife tourism built around beaver spotting has become a genuine draw in places like Perthshire, with guided beaver safaris now regularly booked to full capacity. Some estimates suggest that a single well-established reintroduction site can bring in somewhere around £2 million a year into the local economy through tourism alone. Which means these animals aren't just reshaping rivers anymore. They're reshaping local economies too. So here's what I think the real lesson is, after everything we just went through together. 11 beavers didn't simply return to a forgotten river and fix it overnight, the way the title of this video might make it sound. What actually happened was messier, slower, and honestly, far more human than that. It was a quiet act of rebellion by anonymous rogue rewilders that the government almost undid. It was a genetic near miss that could have quietly collapsed the entire project before most people even knew it existed. It was measurable, verified science proving these animals can filter pollution almost as well as engineered infrastructure. And it was, and still is, an unresolved argument between farmers, conservationists, and lawmakers about how much space we're actually willing to give back to a species we spent centuries trying to erase. Scotland didn't just release 11 beavers into a forgotten river. It opened up a 15-year-long experiment in whether humans can actually coexist with the species they once destroyed. And that experiment is still running right now in rivers across Scotland while you're watching this video. If this kind of deep dive is what you come to this channel for, the real, sourced, complicated version of stories that usually get flattened into a 2-minute headline, then subscribe, because there are a lot more of these coming. And if you want to go even deeper into anything covered in this video, from the genetic rescue operation to the ongoing legal fight over beaver culling? Let me know in the comments, because that could easily be its own full episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.